All right, thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this session. My name is Joe D'Angelo. I'm the Director of Product Management for our software-defined storage and resiliency solutions at Veritas. Joining me today will be John Hink. John, introduce yourself.
I'm John Hink. I'm a product director for basically our data protection and data integrity. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you very much for joining us for what is sitting room only, I see here at today's session. But today we're going to be talking about a few topics, actually, core to cyber resiliency for your data center. And at Veritas, we have a pretty vast portfolio of technologies, ranging from high availability, disaster recovery, data protection, et cetera. Obviously, we can't go into all those in great detail. So if at any point, if you see something that's really interesting, we encourage you guys to come talk to us afterwards. Come join us at the booth, at the Expo Hall. We can dig in real deep with whatever topics you guys find interesting. So you ask, when we talk about cyber resiliency and we talk about how you can sort of, I would say, bolster or strengthen your defense against the ransomware attacks that are pervasive in today's enterprise IT, it comes down to two things. This notion that your business depends on a certain set of applications and workloads. They drive the consumers that use your products and services, but at the same time, those applications depend on sets of data. And in order to have a comprehensive resiliency strategy, one that's going to account for all the different factors, all the different facets, whether it's a threat to the particular data itself or a compromise of your compute infrastructure, you need to be able to protect both. So over the course of the next hour, we're going to be walking you through how you can strengthen both that compute, those applications and those services, as well as the lifeblood of those applications, which is the data itself. So some of the things you have to consider when you put together and you're architecting a cyber resiliency strategy is really, it boils down to RPO versus RTO. And we all have heard these expressions before. We understand what these initials mean, this notion of recovery point, recovery time. But often it's a trade-off, right? Is there a situation where you can sacrifice the amount of data that you can protect in terms of hours, minutes, hours, and days versus how quickly can you restore those applications and those services. And this is a conversation that you have to have, and this is a decision that you have to make in terms of what's right for your business. And the great thing about Veritas is that we actually give you the ability to, and we're going to go through some of the capabilities that we have in order to achieve both, so that you can have that very, very strict resiliency strategy that will bring back your applications very quickly, but also you can ensure that the data is not going to be compromised or it's not going to be impacted unnecessarily. So in order to do that, we actually have two sets of technologies under our Alta Cloud brand. And I want to hand it over to John right now to talk a little bit about what that data protection piece is about.
So yeah, let's talk about the data protection side of things. So in data protection, what you're really trying to do is ensure that all this data, your IP, your intellectual property, all the things that are important to running your business are available, are protected, and secured, right? So if you think about that, it has to work in a couple different ways. One of them is we have to be able to find and identify the assets that you need protected. We need to deliver protection of those, and then we have to provide a life cycle for that. What we've done with the Alta Data Protection is really thinking about how do we do this in the context of cloud workloads, cloud infrastructure, or cloud services, but still maintain the ability to work cross-cloud, on-prem to cloud, and have consistency across all those different venues. One of the big things we've done is working on what we call our cloud scale technology, and I'll talk more about that later. And that really is basically taking the traditional applications, how they work, and making them work in a much more cloud native functionality. Really working on what we want to build is that effortless global data protection. This is the idea that you shouldn't have to spend all day long trying to figure out how to make a system work so that you can get what you want, right? We want systems and infrastructure that's going to work, that's going to be intelligent, and is going to get you the outcomes you want. And so your job should be in the business of finding outcomes. And then as we think about that, like I said, it's that consistent protection, right? So we have a lot of people we work with that have massive infrastructures, and they're not all in on one sort of form factor deployment. They're not all on-prem, they're not all on the cloud. They have public cloud, a hybrid cloud, they're across different cloud service providers. And to have someone say, you know what, I found this service or this workload that's over here that's really useful for me and I want you to protect it. We don't want you to have to sit there and go, I need to relearn everything just for that one guy. Or say, you can't use that because I don't know how to do that. For us, it's same interface, same architecture, same style. You just click on through to get to there. And finally is we're really working on how do we talk about ransomware? How do we secure things in an intelligent way? Back in the day, it used to be just you have a backup, right? And it's turned into so much more about that. And so we've done a lot of work, I'll talk about later, about how we can be a lot more proactive in that sense. And so that's on the data protection side. And then, Joe, you want to talk a little bit about application resiliency?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of echo what John was saying, I think it's crucial that you have a consistent and predictable experience across all the different applications, all the different services, all the different workloads that you have to protect. Data centers and your environments are growing more diverse, more heterogeneous. So operationally, being able to address those needs, whether it's a cyber resiliency threat, having to do with the traditional threats that data centers have faced. And in terms of that compute and those applications, understanding the notion of being able to orchestrate disaster recovery across a myriad of different locales. And we're going to go into some details about how within AWS you can achieve multi-AZ, multi-region, and different form factors and different configurations. You also want to be able to optimize the workloads, right? You want to be able to strengthen a work. Okay. See, there's threats everywhere, right?
Roll with it.
Not sure what that was, but we're gonna forge ahead. You want to optimize those environments as well, ensuring that you maximize not only the utilization, but performance and resiliency thereof. And then, of course, being consistent, right? So know that if you're running something on-prem today in, say, an outpost, and you want to move that into, quote unquote, the mothership of AWS, you can do that very efficiently. If you've got workloads that are running in the physical world today on-prem, and you want to move those transparently into AWS, you can do that as well with our technologies. And of course, being able to address this across all the different factors, platforms, and applications. So we're really keen on being able to support not only those off-the-shelf workloads, but ones that you create yourself, as well as establishing all the interdependencies there. So orchestrating those resources, ensuring that they're efficiently managed, but also resilient in the face of any number of different threats. So with that, let's talk a little about that storage efficiency component and how that's sort of the foundation for what this resiliency strategy is. And John, why don't you talk a little bit about with Alta Data Protection and how we do that?
Sure, and this is a bit of a fun slide here. Who here knows where pretty much when people work in the cloud, where all their money is going, right? Where is the biggest spends, the biggest pain points? What is actually, for a lot of customers, their biggest barrier with moving to the cloud, especially if they're concerned about data protection? This all goes back in the old days when people were running everything on-prem. They started saying, "Can I use cloud as a storage target?" What did they run into? It's too expensive, right? And so this is something that Veritas has spent years and years looking at. What is the best way to solve that problem for customers? How to manage your cost effectively. And to do that, we've actually built some really cool storage technologies that, say, it's basically what you had to do on-prem to solve the problem if I want to, write to disk instead of tape, right? How do I get the deduplication to work? How do I do data reduction? How do I do that globally, and how do I do that efficiently? Those are the things that we've really focused on. And I'll get into a little bit more later, but the whole idea is that if we can take your data, all these backup copies, and your things that are stuck on snapshots of multiple duplicate copies of OSs and things like that, your prices go up significantly once you start to talk about serious enterprise cloud data protection. What we do is we can get you that same quality, we get the high quality data protection that you're used to and you expect, while keeping that price point significantly low through high level optimization with a global deduplication that distributes all the work, so you always get the performance you need when you need to have it happen. And in this, people kind of give you a hard time. They say, how can you put numbers up there? How can you back those up? And we actually do. These are based on cost analysis that have been done with customers. It's done with cost analysis that we've done with third parties. And if you look around, if you stop by our booth, I can point you to some articles that are getting published that help back that up. So that's why we focus on the data protection. And I'll talk about it a little bit more, but I always like to stress this is a significant piece of technology that's really cool. It does data deduplication. It does it inline. It does memory. There's no block storage required to get it work. It writes everything to object storage. And it gets you really high level efficiency and consumption, something we worked on for years. Joe,
cool.
You want to talk about the next one?
Yeah, so one of the things that, again, that we're really proud of at Veritas is that we look at both sides of the coin, right? There's this notion of the secondary and tertiary copies of the data, which are critical in the event of a cyber attack or critical in the process of doing recovery. But what about the primary data? How do you ensure that the primary data is resilient? The primary data is performant. So some of the technologies that we have within our Alta application resiliency portfolio deal with that specific use case. So whether it's being able to take advantage of, in the same form factor, in the same footprint, instant store, EBS storage as well as object-based S3 targets, you can take advantage of all of those, optimizing how those workloads perform, meaning that you can leverage an intelligent set of policies that move, again, primary data amongst those different storage tiers. Again, this gives you a way to optimize the full consumption of the storage that you use within AWS. And it's through a combination of technologies that we call Smart AO and Smart Tier, again, for ensuring the performance and the optimization of those primary data sets, but also for maximizing the utilization of the storage that you do have. So with that, I'll hand it back over to John. I want to take us through a little bit of the architecture of cloud scale so you can understand from a data protection standpoint how all these pieces actually fit together.
Sure. So let's, I said earlier I'd talk about this more, but let's think about this idea. If you're starting to work in the cloud space, people go through these different journeys, I've noticed, and what they do is a lot of people are like, well, I ran out of VM on-prem, why don't I just run a VM in the cloud, right? And what happens is that starts to drive your costs up. That causes all sorts of challenges. So we started to look at what are better ways to solve that problem. Now, I talked about all the cool deduplication stuff, how we can save you a ton of money and help drive those costs down or help you manage those costs better in the cloud. But that doesn't help if you have to manage a complicated multi-VM headache of a system to manage. And so we looked at that and said, what can we do better? How can we move away from a server-based architecture and move to a more of a services-based architecture? And so that's just what we've done. As we think about this idea, we took this idea of global management across platforms, right? And so this is what we say when we look at the very top, we'll have a management plane. We call this Alta View, right? So there's Alta View data protection. This is the way that we can look down into what's going on, not just with systems on-prem, but systems in cloud, and we can manage all those outcomes. We can help deliver those and essentially get you that infrastructure. Now it all rides on top of the cloud-based technologies we've done. So this basically, the Alta View will run you can run that as a service that delivers a service out to you that allows you to get the data protection, allows you to manage that data protection. So if you think you've got some customers have dozens and dozens of endpoints and services and stuff like that fan out to multiple additional machines, and they have to manage that. So this is a great way to put everything in one box and globally manage it across all those systems. Now, in the cloud specifically, this is where we get into the cloud scale technology. Even deeper, I want to go into this, is this idea that I want to be able to build a technology that can scale to that workload I need, right? If you think about it, if you're building things on-prem, you gotta do a capital expenditure. You gotta buy hardware that's gonna be able to do the most work you need to do and be there ready to go all the time, right? In the cloud, you really don't want to have to do that. You don't want to have to provision things or have them running unless you're using them. You don't want to spend money on things unless you're actually doing it. So we focus on doing that with this idea of an architecture that uses the multi kind of tier approach. And this is the idea that I have a public cloud I'm running in. I have a control plane or a control plane I'm running in. I've got a data plane where I'm storing my data. I have that management plane I just talked about. This allows us to basically get out here and deliver that sort of protection that we want to get that's going to give us the scale that we need. So if you look into the architecture, like Joe said, this is probably my favorite picture, I guess, so far, is if you think about it, you have an application that you've been running on-prem for years, and that application has had to figure out how to scale across multiple servers. So you do that by processes that come and go, processes that start and stop depending on the workloads, but you're paying for those servers all the time. What we did is we were able to take that same architecture and modify it really slightly. It was a cool architecture, and it fit great to run in a containerized infrastructure. So if you think about it, if I have things that are going to run, and I only want them to run when I want them to run, I want them to go away, that's ephemeral services, right? This lines up with that architecture. So what we've been able to do is take all of these different things, break them up into service-based architecture. So instead of big servers that are sitting around burning money when you don't need to, they're services. And a lot of those services, they only run when you need them. A lot of that work has been moved into data movement pods, which are basically ephemeral. So if you think about that deduplication I talked about, when you do deduplication to object storage, that happens in an ephemeral data mover pod that is dedicated to that job. It does it just for that workload. If you have more jobs start, they get more dedicated services. And leveraging things like EKS and whatnot, we can actually scale that across nodes as needed. But if you only do that for 2 hours a day, that's the only time you pay for it. And so it's a big cost saving. It really helps drive down the compute cost of getting all those storage savings I talked about. And so that's really how we've gone about approaching that. It's kind of a cool technology, and we're continuing to build on that. And it's actually a lot of fun to have something where you're like I said, you just turn it on, you set it up, you run it. If your workload suddenly increased overnight, you don't even need to worry about it. It just happens. It takes care of it. So getting into the Alta View thing, I want to talk about that a little bit more, is This is basically what we want to dig into, is the idea that if I want to go in there and do that global management, I want to be able to manage all these outcomes I talked about, manage all these things that you want to worry about. I have backups, I have restores, I have all these sorts of things, I have policies, I have life cycles for my storage. You know, we have some customers we work with, they have all sorts of different storage requirements. Some people only got to keep things for 30 days. Some people for 2 years. Some people for, you know, in the medical verticals, people have to keep data for the life of a patient, right? How do you manage that to keep those outcomes and, you know, move it to lower cost storage tiers, all those sort of things. So you think about it, I have to think of medical is a great example where I might have to do that for 50 hospitals, right? Or 50 different locations, right? We have customers that have endpoints in stores, thousands of stores that they're managing endpoints, right? How do you do all that without having to hop around to different things? You know, how do I want to go around to, you know, to 1,000 different places to try to do that? So we have this cloud-based service that can globally manage all that and allows you to basically make policy definitions, those sort of things, push those out to where they need to go so that work gets done. On top of that, we have an analytics platform that we also can run. This is, you know, once again, it's a service, right? This isn't something you have to go install. This is something, a service you can run from Veritas on our Alta Services platform. This allows you to get full visibility of your environment. This will interrogate, it will dive into your data center, your cloud infrastructure. It will find out everything in there. It will actually get all of the things that you have in there in your environment, not just our products, but you think about storage devices, other service providers, those sort of assets. It will find all those assets, figure out what's going on. It can do predictions of how much things are costing you, if you have to charge back to other departments. It's a great way to get insights in analytics about what's going on with your environment. And once again, it's really powerful, but you can consume it as a service, and it really helps kind of get that accessibility to that product. Finally, is one thing that's relatively new. This just came out a few months, earlier in the year, basically. Is, remember the cloud scale thing I talked about? Like, oh, Kubernetes runs things, scales, does all the backups for you, saves you lots of money. You know, for some people, they say that's cool, but Kubernetes terrifies me, right? And so if you're in that class where you're like, I don't even want to deal with, I don't want to know, right? I just want it to work. We can provide that as a service. So we have a backup as a service on our Alta Services platform. And simply, your entire experience is going into the UI and picking what you want it to do, telling it to do it, and making sure it gets done. So that wraps up some of those things, but you're going to talk about application resiliency, right?
Yes, thanks, John. So listening to what we've discussed here momentarily is the idea that on the data side, we want to ensure, again, that is resilient and that architecture can scale and that architecture can sustain across a myriad of different use cases and environments. But when we think about the compute aspect of this, right, what's delivering those applications and services, that too also has to be resilient. So if you think about it from how granularly can you see into those applications, understanding the relationship that app has to those various storage resources, being able to see beyond just the virtual machine or the physical infrastructure, but actually the constituent application. Orchestrating multi-tier workloads, right? That's also a challenge that many customers that we've dealt with face. This idea of how do I ensure that it's not just one individual application, but rather a sort of a tapestry of applications and services with upstream and downstream dependencies that you have to be able to orchestrate and recover. And when the time comes and you have that event, right, that operational savings is really what's crucial. And that's where we get into time to recover, right? This idea of RTO, being able to reduce that down so that you're not concerned with, at that moment, okay, what is the process, right? It's predictable and it's repeatable. You also want to be able to tailor performance, this notion of not one size fits all. Some workloads may require different forms of recovery. They might be on different tiers or different levels of business criticality. And then with that also comes this idea of validation, right? How do I test to ensure that the procedures that I put in place are going to work when the time comes, and that I'm confident to know that it actually will execute correctly? And lastly, around cyber threat sophistication, that's growing in expansive sets of threats that are occurring daily. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when you will be subjected to some form of cyber attack. How can you then protect not only that secondary and tertiary copies of data, but that primary data as well? And we'll get into that here momentarily. So So let's talk a little bit about some of the actual disaster recovery capabilities or the orchestration pieces that we have. If you have a workload that's on-prem today and you do want to move that into the cloud, or if you do want to take advantage of the cloud as a way to sort of insulate yourself from some of the threats that might be happening on-prem. So through our InfoScale technology, or how it is branded in the cloud as Alta Application Resiliency, you're actually able to take workloads and replicate them directly from essentially what is any existing infrastructure you have on-prem today into EC2. Now that also could be the VMC, right, the VMware Cloud in AWS. The source of those workloads can be on Windows, they can be on Linux, they could even be a legacy Unix environment. We can help you actually convert that and transfer that over to AWS as well. Through this technology, it allows you to transparently move those applications, move those workloads at that level of granularity, giving you the control on when you want to move that workload or when you want to house it in AWS. Now, once that workload is existent inside of EC2, again, this would be an infrastructure as a service type of application, an SAP workload, an Oracle workload, a WebSphere or Informatica, something along those lines. You have to think about the considerations for how do you make it highly available under the different form factors, whether it's in a single availability zone, if it's in multiple availability zones, or even multiple regions altogether. So one of the use cases that we have that's actually quite popular is this notion of being able to take any EBS storage volume that you have associated with a workload and actually can associate it and attach it and detach it and move it to different services and different EC2 instances within the same availability zone. And this all happens automatically in response to a programmatic detection of a fault, meaning whether it's the application itself or any other infrastructure component that would have an issue. We would take then that appropriate action. Now, this particular example involves using any EBS storage volume that you like. There are examples, however, where you can attach an EBS storage volume to multiple instances simultaneously through a multi-attach. We do support that as well, but there are limitations to that in terms of the number of instances or the types of storage that you can use that with. In this particular example, what here is you could do this on Linux, you can do this on Windows, on any particular storage resource you want. So you don't have to sacrifice any of the high availability that you would have on-prem. You can reproduce that very easily inside of a single availability zone. Now, if it comes down to the availability zone itself can become the cause for a particular outage, you can extend that resiliency to include multiple availability zones. And one of the really great things that we do with InfoScale or with Alta Application Resiliency is that we actually overcome some storage restrictions that you have with EBS storage, specifically how the volumes themselves can only exist in a single AZ at any given time. Well, with our technology, you actually can mirror them between availability zones transparently. And you can have a workload that fails over automatically between availability zones. We handle all of the necessary network translation. We handle all of the IP and virtual IP association. So now you can have an automatic failover across AZs in response to any number of different threats or any number of different circumstances that might come about. And this is actually a very powerful use case, right? Because now you've bolstered your applications. You've basically galvanized your workload against any number of different threats that might happen throughout or be systemic throughout an availability zone. Now, this is available today on Linux. It's also available on Windows, but it's done slightly differently with our Windows use case, whereas in the previous example, we're talking about mirroring data at the volume level. Here, we're actually talking about replicating the data. Now, it's all done synchronously, so we have an RPO. Right? You're not going to lose any data moving from one AZ to the other. In this particular example, though, instead of you would actually be replicating data from one host to the other, whereas in the previous example, it would be a single volume just being mirrored between, similar to what you might see in like a campus cluster configuration on-prem. This use case, again, is extensible for Linux and Windows, and for all the different workloads that we support. Our catalog is extensive, again, whether it's SAP or WebSphere, TIBCO, Informatica, SQL Server, any number of different homegrown applications all fit within this framework. Now, to be extensible even further, we know that any particular architecture that for high availability needs to also include the ability to do disaster recovery. And I can't stress enough that when we talk about DR and we talk about high availability, we're talking about it at the application level, which is very unique here in that we're not talking about the virtual machine, we're not talking about a sort of an abstraction here. We're actually talking about the app itself. So being able to provide disaster recovery with the same user experience, the same capability that you had to provide HA is very important when you, again, are trying to introduce new applications, new services, and overcome some of the challenges there. So what we allow for is the asynchronous replication across regions altogether. This could be from US East 1 all the way to US West 1. It doesn't really matter. It's globally available and gives you that option of choosing, again, the target that you want, the AZ that you want. You can mix and match. You can have multiple nodes running at one particular AZ or one particular region. You can have a running at a secondary site or a secondary location, all of which is, again, up to you to determine what those priorities are. And some of the cool things that you can do here, too, is that you can validate this. So if you did do this configuration and you were saying, OK, I know that in the event of a particular attack or an event of whatever threat or conditions that might cause me to have to fail over, I want to know that I want to successfully bring this workload up, but I don't want to disrupt my production to do so. We have this great concept called a fire drill, which allows you to actually test and validate against a snapshot of your primary data at your secondary site. This allows you to, again, gain the confidence that your workload can be brought up online in response to any number of different threats, and it won't disrupt your production environment at all. Now, one of the more important things to consider, too, is when dealing with any HA or disaster recovery use case is going to be the orchestration across multi-tiers. Now, in most environments, a single application is not going to drive your business. It's going to be sort of a combination of workloads. Again, I used that word tapestry earlier, this idea of upstream and downstream services that have to work interdependently with one another, sort of in concert with one another. And we have a capability that we call a virtual business service, which allows you to create a relationship between those different services. So now the administration of all of these different recovery options, whether it's in a single AZ, multiple AZs, multiple regions, or even on-prem into the cloud, you can actually draw a dotted line from all of the different technologies that you're using, all the different services, to your actual business outcome, right? Today, whether it's an ERP system or an EHR or any number of different services that you're offering, again, they have all these different apps and there's database tiers and application tiers and web tiers. All those pieces now can be brought together into a logical construct called the virtual business service. We have a very powerful workflow engine that gives you the ability to test and validate not only those individual tiers, but the entirety of that recovery, which I think is really important, again, when you're trying to reduce that operational overhead. Now, all of this is all well and good, right, if you're able to deploy and configure all these pieces. And what we have found is that one of the biggest hurdles is really about the speed at which you can actually adopt and take advantage of these capabilities. So one of the things that we've actually expanded on now is actually introduced an entire SaaS portal that we call the Application Mobility Service, which actually discovers the workloads that you have on-prem and gives you the ability to synthesize what we call a cloud twin, effectively giving you an accelerated path into AWS such that those workloads that were running on-prem now can be built and configured from the start as a resilient service. The really amazing thing about this is that it works for existing on-prem InfoScale users, or if you have a situation where you are not using that technology on-prem but wanted to take advantage of it in the cloud, you can do so as well through a set of predetermined resiliency policies and templates so that you don't even really need to understand how all those interdependencies work. We actually can configure and deploy those for you. So in this particular example, if you have running the technology on-prem, we can prepare that environment, discover those interdependencies. From there, we can actually set up the different layouts that you want in the cloud, whether it's a single AZ, multiple AZs, or multiple regions. And then from there, we actually can generate the configuration through a set of AMIs that we have pre-built, or in our next release, what we're going to have is the ability to source the configuration directly from your own AMI that you may have running with whatever pre-built configurations. A lot of times we found customers are not too keen to use an external source. They'd like to use an image that they've created and that they know has all the different security components already built in. After which, that same concept that we said before about that idea of a fire drill, you can validate this configuration and you can ensure that it will behave appropriately, it will attach to and perform in accordance with your SLAs. Now, as I said before, this idea that if you're not an existing InfoScale or Alta application resiliency user, no sweat. We actually allow for this use case to build from scratch new configurations directly in AWS. So again, whether it's something as simple as an active-passive configuration for a simple database application, or something far more sophisticated that involves multiple tiers, multiple different services, all of those can be deployed and configured through through a template-based process. So you, again, don't need to have to understand at low level all the minutiae, all of the, the gory details on how these pieces work. We actually take and optimize that for you. And if you are interested to learn more about this, we actually do have demos of this and recorded demos at the booth that we'd love to be able to go through with you guys and show you in more detail. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to John to talk a little bit about something that's actually quite a remarkable capability that we introduced that we call the Red Lab.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things. And it's a little tricky with these presentations in our company because we do a lot of things. Like we do a lot of stuff, and so we always have to decide what do we want to talk about. So, we talked about the application resiliency, right? Making sure your stuff keeps running, make sure that it's there, to the second sometimes if you need that. We've talked about the data protection, the backup and recovery, how do you do that large at scale. That's for all the cloud workloads, which I didn't talk about, but we back up all your IaaS, your PaaS, your object storages, your data lakes. We can back all those up and recover them across clouds and all that sort of stuff. It's really cool. The one thing I really want to talk about, because we were trying to focus a little bit more on cybersecurity, is we've done some stuff in our products that is really cool. You've probably heard about it, where we had like anomaly, an AI-based anomaly detection engine that analyzes activity that's going on with data protection and looks for events that might say, this looks really weird, right? So for anomaly detection, if it's a problem, lets you know about it, reports to the CM and SOAR, allows you to take corrective action, right? Say you see you have a problem, we have malware detection, right? Where we can actually look into the contents of a backup, we can analyze it for malicious code using either provided from us or third-party, technologies will do things like antivirus and look at that and figure it out, right? We've done all those sort of things to build on, the answer to ransomware used to just be, do a restore, and now we build into, well, how do you know your backups are good, right? And how do you protect that? But what we found is that kept on changing, that problem, right? Because it used to be, your production information gets hit, right? You do a restore. The hackers aren't dumb. What do? They try to hit your backup infrastructure. So we started to take that really, really, really seriously. To do that, we built something called the Red Lab. So the Red Lab is a real-world testing with a best-of-breed ecosystem. That's something that Veritas does. We actually have a laboratory staffed by data protection experts and cybersecurity experts who are doing live testing of all our products. So they literally are an isolated environment. They go into this thing. All they do is spend all day is looking at basically, how could I go in? How could this be hacked? What kind of holes could we find, right? And then they go out and they find this malicious code. They find these ransomware devices or technologies, and they actually get them, they inject them into this environment. So we got simulated workloads, we've got simulated data protection, simulated parts of our analytics platform, or those are real ones, but the simulated customer, they're not real customer workloads. But basically, we let that stuff go crazy and see what happens. And we're actually working with multiple, third parties, security companies, to help validate their technologies. So we say, hey, what if we put your stuff in our environment? Does it catch, does it catch things, right? So sometimes that's, great, first line of defense worked, right? But a lot of times it doesn't. So we've actually had to report a lot of things to third parties to say, hey, there's something new we've noticed or a new technique. If you think about it, one of the big things that it has from attack vectors, it keeps on continuously evolving. So we're always finding new things. Like every month or two, there's something new. And there's a lot of targeting backup infrastructure. So, you all read the news, right? You hear about companies that have been hit, and they say, cool, we got hit by ransomware, we got to do a restore, and then kind of hear, we got to do a restore. Oh, well, okay, well, we're just going to pay the ransom, right? This happened for two reasons. One of them is because their backup software can't restore things fast enough because it hasn't really been built to do that. Or, quite often, it's been impacted somewhere, or they didn't know they had backups. Because what do the hackers do? Is they get into those environments, right? They try to get in between this, if it's insecure, if there's not security levels in there, to try and expire images, right? We try to stave that off with multi-factor authentication, with 4 eyes, authorization changes, and we try, immutable storage that we can do everywhere, right? Deleting that backup storage, same thing, immutable storage helps you protect against that, helps you get that defenses up there, right? Other things we've seen is trying to get admin rights for backup systems, right? And they'll do that by calling the help desk, right? So same thing, if you're backup admin, his credentials get out there. We figured out systems and ways to prevent that by basically having maybe somebody else has to sign off on an operation, things like that. And the biggest thing is that one of the cool things that I think we've seen, or one of the interesting things we've seen, is they start targeting, if you have a client application or there's some interface that backup operation gets done, they try to break that cycle. They try to get in there and prevent the backup data from ever getting collected or sent to the backup system, because then our anomaly detection doesn't notice that. We just see a failure, and people might not respond to that the same way. Oh, backup failure, I gotta get to that, I gotta look at that and find out, I'll do that over the weekend, and you find out that everything's been corrupted. So we're actually generating this information. We're actually finding updated anomaly guidance, updated for our ML that basically updated concepts and technologies that we put in there. And we actually can work on how do we we act as a global intelligence provider. We can actually look at how do we get that stuff provided. It gets a deliverable package that can go out, and you can actually extend that into, we have, like I said, AltaView, right? You can extend that out and get that deployed onto multiple domains, cross domains, that say, hey, here's some new things to look for. Very similar to what you expect from an antivirus thing, but we're actually pushing it out specialized for our anomaly detection engine. On top of that, what we're looking at is overall, how can we have a global ransomware dashboard for your Alta products, right? The idea that you should be able to go on into your service platform and see what's going on, to see, here's a hotspot here, there's been some activity here, there's been a problem here, right? And how to do the report of that. And that's something that we're building, and we're continuing to build upon that to deliver that sort of protection. So, to wrap up on the Red Lab, it is really designed to be like an independent research, targeted specifically in the data protection sphere, targeted on making sure that our appliances, our big BYO deployments, our cloud-based deployments, are the best in breed when it comes to being defensible, right? So I think about it like, you give me your data, right? I do your backup, I take your data. I need to treat that data like it's the most important thing out there, right? I don't want anyone getting into it. And we use that independent research to make sure that we're not listening, we're not fooling ourselves, right? Bring some stuff in, bring third parties in, that sort of thing to see what can go on. We have an appliance architecture. We call it a flex appliance architecture. This is individual flex appliances or flex scale out appliances, right? Is a container-based architecture built upon an immutable architecture, built upon immutable storage, and some of the most resilient boxes you can get, right? We have had customers, through no fault of our own, right, who have been impacted by ransomware, and everything in the data center gets wrecked except for that Veritas appliance, right? And that's the only thing still running. They turn around and start doing recovery right away. We have customers who have been hit by ransomware, entire domains taken out, and 6 hours later it's back up and running again, because they just had to kick off the automated recovery operations. And if you think about this, is we have to have threat protection on every level, right? So we have threat protection in how the scheduling service and how the scheduling and the operations and the planning works. Threat protection about when we get the data, as soon as we consume that data, it's automatically encrypted. It's encrypted during transport. It stays in, never is not encrypted. The only time that data is decrypted is when it gets restored onto a disk somewhere, and hopefully that's a disk with some level of encryption. And finally, like that anomaly detection engine I talked about, it's a really cool process by which we started looking at the idea of anomalies, and this is there's some other processes out there about anomaly analysis and whatnot, and look at what's going on with data. And we looked at the things that they were doing, and we found, hey, that's all stuff we get when we run a backup, right? Like how many files were in there? Were the number of files dramatically changed? Did the size change? Did the dedupe rates, as the entropy increased, right? Those sort of things. And so we're like, we have all that stuff in line with every job. So if we can, every job happens, it can parallelize those operations to feed those individually into an anomaly detection engine. They can tell you within a few minutes whether or not there's something you should be concerned about. And like I said, it's a learning machine system. It learns from what it's doing. It updates its activities based on feedback and works on how to get you better results, and make sure that if there's something wrong, if that first line of defense from your primary security providers failed, you have something to back you up on that. Now, Joe,
Yes, John.
You want to talk about Secure FS, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So in keeping with this theme, right, of being able to balance out your resiliency strategy, one with the data as well as the services, the data in a backup copy or in a tertiary copy, but the data at the primary source. We've introduced a capability that we call Secure FS. Now, Secure FS is included, again, with Alta Application Resiliency and Alta, or InfoScale and Alta Application Resiliency. And it's designed to provide a means to recover rapidly from primary data corruption or a ransomware attack or a malware attack on your primary data. And we're able to achieve this is because the software itself takes ownership of the storage layer, right? We become the volume manager, we are the file system, we take ownership over those different components. And in the case of Secure FS, what it allows you to do is create immutable checkpoints or off-host copies of that data that can then be used to restore rapidly. So whether it's a large database or if it's just a set of unstructured files, they can be restored and recovered rapidly. You may find yourself in a situation where you have a large workload or a large database that the idea of being able to recover multi-terabytes may take some time, right? This idea that if you go back to the beginning of our conversation about RTOs versus RPOs, if RTO is so crucial for you, meaning every minute of downtime costs you both in reputation and in dollars and cents, then being able to restore quickly is going to be the primary path. So through Secure FS, you then can take whether it's, again, a database workload, which we actually have integration points with, so we actually can quiesce that database and ensure that it's a crash consistent and file system consistent snapshot. We can then turn that checkpoint of that snapshot into a worm snapshot so that it can't be affected, it can't be deleted, or it can't be removed, but it can be used for restoration purposes. And this is all automated through our dashboard. Our operations manager dashboard gives you the ability to configure the different policies set forth. And one of the things that we're actually really excited about introducing, and it's going to be in the coming months, is actually the ability to scan those images for the presence of any particular ransomware attack. And that way you could actually either green light or red flag a particular checkpoint. And we get asked all the time, they're like, well, you can do all these really interesting things, but how do you know when that actual attack has happened? Where can you ensure that you have a valid recovery point? So we've taken that to heart, and we're going to be introducing that capability in the very near future. So really excited about this. It pairs so incredibly well with a lot of the other security features that we've introduced over the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months. We now support secure boot UEFI firmware so that all of the packages that get installed are signed and that that you won't have any malicious code that gets installed that way. We also support full breadth of encryption on both Linux and on Windows to ensure from any data exfiltration, because often these malware attacks, these ransomware attacks come with this need to exfiltrate that data and be able to take it and extort the end users for it. So being able to encrypt that, ensure that that process is really stopped right in its tracks. All right. So with that, John, I'll let you kind of take a brief moment here and summarize what we've from a data protection standpoint.
So some things just to summarize some of the values here is like Joe was saying, right? You have different levels of security that you need to have for your applications and for your data, right? You need to be able to have the data, like I said, needs to be secured, needs to be protected, but the applications need to be resilient too. You need to have applications that you can keep running. If you could have something get hit or get impacted and 10 seconds later, it's right back where you needed it, right? Or in a different region or a different location. If you can do that at department level, that's great. If you need to move that data, you need to have resiliency or need to have compliance, compliance that you need to meet, you need to have that data protection as well. For the cloud solutions, for Alta Cloud Solutions, what we're really focusing on is how can you have kind of a global unified platform where you can consume all those things, both as something maybe you would run on premises, right? Or something that you would run in cloud, maybe as yourself. You can run as IaaS, you can run it as a Kubernetes-based deployment. But also, how can we use these services that we can also run as a service, right? And so it gives you the kind of choice, but you get consistency, right? Because there's different things, and like nobody wants to switch context, no one wants to have to relearn things. And ultimately, what we're really focusing on is how can we get you the flexible recovery we want, how can we get the data resiliency we want, how can we make sure it doesn't break the bank and it manages that total cost, and how is that secure, and biggest one we're thinking about is how is it automated, right? How, essentially, how can we make things easier for you, right? It's a complicated process, it's a complicated stuff you're trying to do, right? This isn't simple, right? But it can be easy, and that's one of the biggest things we're focusing on. It's how can we take complex operations, complex things you need to do, and make them simple, or easy, not simple, easy, cost efficient, and really going to be right for what you need for really what we say is enterprise data protection that not only do you get on-prem, but you also get in the cloud. Yeah. So with that, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. It's been great talking to you.
Appreciate it, guys. And certainly join us at the booth if you want to know more about the technologies.
Yes.